Welcome to Resilience in the Shadows, the podcast by TentMakers of Louisiana. I'm your host, Alex Payton, joined by my co-host and mom, Leticia Payton, Executive Director and co-founder of TentMakers of Louisiana. Today, we welcome our special guest, Ramon Vargas. Ramon is a journalist and writer for The Guardian, known for his investigative work that brings attention and accountability to stories that often go unheard. Through thoughtful reporting and a commitment to truth, he sheds light on systemic issues that impact survivors, marginalized communities, and those affected by institutional injustice. His reporting has explored topics ranging from clergy abuse and corruption to failures in protective systems, with empathy and persistence. Ramon gives voice to survivors and helps the public understand the deeper implications behind the headlines. In this episode, we'll explore how journalism can play a crucial role in survivor advocacy, the ethical responsibilities of reporters covering trauma, and how media exposure intersects with the healing and justice process. Ramon, welcome to Resilience in the Shadows. Thank you for joining us. Ramon, welcome to Resilience in the Shadows. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank y'all for having me.
So let's start off with your personal background, Ramon. Can you start by sharing a bit about your early influences, came from your family, the community, or any personal experience that really sparked your interest in journalism as a whole?
Sure. I grew up was born and raised in obviously in the New Orleans area. I went to Catholic schools my whole life. My parents wanted me to be, they were both physicians, and my sister ended up becoming a physician as well. I think they wanted me to be a doctor too. Always had a thing for, I'd always be reading books and just get something in me that was man, I kind of want to write one of these one day and have my name on this. And, to read newspapers and just watch the news, and thought it would always be an interesting career to do. Believe it or not, I used to have a thing for, I'd play a lot of video games too and want to review them and read the reviews. And, for a minute had a fleeting, man, maybe I can be in the gaming press. But I developed a taste, I think, for news and sports and things like that. I think when I got my chance to being a full-time sports writer, I found that truly, if I was going to spend the effort and time that it took to do journalism and to do it well, I would want it to, I'd prefer it to just kind of be hard news, and that's what kind of gravitated me toward that field. I used, when I was at Jesuit High School, I started at the newspaper there. Then I went to the newspaper at Loyola, the Maroon. Ended up helping the staff win kind of one of the collegiate Pulitzers, and felt I was hooked after that, and have been in journalism pretty much since.
So you're known a lot around New Orleans and Louisiana for your reporting on the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. You've broken lots of stories that have sent shockwaves through the survivor communities, and you've got fans, you've got haters, right? Especially when you're reporting on something like this. So you're reporting on the sex abuse scandal. Is that something that comes from any kind of personal drive, or was that more of an evolution in your journalistic career? What's led to that?
That's a good question. I mean, just to put it out there, obviously, I never had any sort of, no one in my immediate family that I know of, nor was I directly affected by by clergy abuse, right? I got a tip it must have been at this point in early September of 2018. I got a tip, and it was about Richard Windman's case. Obviously, if you've discussed it on the program, Richard Windman's case, that he had been abused at my alma mater, Jesuit, by a priest by the name of Neil Carr, who's now dead, as well as a janitor by the name of Pete Modica. And I checked that tip out. It checked out. I wrote the story and figured out that it was one of multiple cases that my alma mater had paid quietly to settle. I reported all of those. It was locally, few, if any, stories have had the impact where I do not think there were a lot of people in New Orleans who I knew who had not seen that story without me having to tell them about it. And after that, it's just been unyielding as far as very recently. I was in an interview. It hasn't been published, but it should be soon. I was in an interview with the survivor of a high profile, one of our highest profile cases that I've covered in conjunction with my colleague David Hammer at WWL Louisiana. Um, and in the middle of that interview, receive a tip on another story that I'm trying to that is would be significant if I'm able to confirm and put out. And that's just to illustrate that it's been, nearly 7 years. In September, it'll be 7 years since the story that I told you about regarding Richard Windman and Jesuit. And I'm still getting those experiences where I'm kind of like dealing with one case on that topic and getting a tip about another case on that topic, sort of in real time. And so it's been, I think that was the way that I've likened it is that it just kind of, it's like a never ending like pit, like a bottomless pit, or like a cave where like you go down one passage and there's 100 other passages and then you choose one to go down and within that passage, there's another 100 in there. And, so sometimes I truly wonder if we'll ever see the end of it.
So, Ramon, I think many people would probably be a little bit surprised to realize that you maybe, outside of New Orleans, that the articles that they read, that you did grow up in Louisiana, you are from New Orleans, and that you are Catholic, know the Catholic faith well, obviously, growing up in the Catholic faith, going to Catholic schools. How has all of this affected your faith? I mean, you know a lot more than most people, because you get all the tips, you have to follow things, you've heard the stories. How has this affected your faith as a Catholic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I wasn't always I wouldn't say I was when I was like innocent and kind of grown up. I wouldn't say that I was like the best, most devout Catholic as it was anyway. I'd go to mass and do the communion. I was never confirmed. It wasn't like a statement other than that got away from me, and I never did it. I have been, I don't want to be dishonest because obviously I live in we live in Southeast Louisiana, and obviously the public education system is what it is, right? I pay to send my child to a Catholic school that is very close to my parents' house, and it's a matter of convenience. Yeah, I check in with him regularly. Do you want to stay? He likes it there. He loves it there. And it is something that like I struggle with, given some of the stuff that I've reported and some of the stuff that I've reported about that they run it. And I think that some people are surprised to find that out. At the same time, I think it's what's best for him. I'm constantly checking in with him, that there's not reprisals for some of the reporting that I've done. The school's been great with him, and he loves it there. And I've kind of let that kind of guide it. And it's also super close to my parents' house, which helps a lot. And as far as like logistics, so I'm just putting that out there because it's not something as if we're having like a frank conversation, like I don't want to hide that fact. Um, I think that one of the things that's been, I think that yeah, like sometimes like it helps to kind of know, it does help, to kind of know, when you hear about like survivors' experiences, and especially like if you it has helped me, I think, and like connect with people and kind of like navigate it. And I mean, I think that sometimes, like, look, an attorney that we write a lot about is Richard Trahant, right? He's a Jesuit guy. His kid went to his sons went to Jesuit. These sorts of things where like you end up. His daughters went to Catholic school, like these things where like you end up on opposite sides of like these institutions that meant a lot to you growing up, right? I think that the values that like Jesuit is the institution that teaches you like the whole meant for others mantra, and the whole like in a dispute between the powerful and the meek, the noble thing is to stand with the meek if you have resources, right? I think it's less fun when those values are like applied against them in a dispute where I am on the opposite side of them, but ultimately think I'm on the right side, right? And I'm not just singling Jesuit out, but the Catholic Church too, like the Archdiocese in general, right? I think that's some of the values that they teach you. So I think sometimes you bring it to bear on behalf of survivors. It ends up putting you against these institutions that mean a lot. But I guess to answer your question, I mean, I wouldn't call myself like a practicing Catholic. I wouldn't call myself like my mother is very devout. My mother is always praying for, like my soul and all that good stuff. I think my dad kind of like goes with her. But outside of, and my child, like to be, just to have like a very like open conversation. Like I've not baptized him, right? That you pay a little more for that. Like in terms of that, I've not baptized him. He will have the chance. I've checked in with him too, like, but he will have the chance to choose his faith and kind of go from there. But so no, I mean, but yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I do not see myself knowing some of the things. And, I think that I've reported this publicly, right? It is quite a moment in your journey. Like when you see the prelate in your community, refer to you as Satan in a text message to someone else that I don't think they ever think you would see, but then end up seeing in your reporting. It is quite a moment, and I think it is. It's difficult to tell the future, and I always say that never is like a long time, right? That whenever someone says I'll never, it's like I always like my comment is always like never is a long time. But I think that there's quite a bit of time and work and I'm not sure that it's ever in the cards that I'll ever be like a devout Catholic or devout anything really.
I think this leads into another good part of the conversation, because I've spoken with other journalists who cover the sex abuse scandal quite often, especially in the church, and a lot of times they do discuss that at some point. And of course, TentMakers, Mom and I, and Mom and Dad, and we've all been here too. But at some point, it gets so heavy, and so not only are you engaging in this on a personal level, but I mean it's also your work, right? So there's professional risk, there's personal risk, and then there's emotional toll probably on both sides. So sticking with the personal, in interviewing survivors, speaking to survivors, digging through cases, digging through tips, what's the personal toll on someone like you having to do all of that? I mean, does it affect you? Are you able to separate yourself far enough and keep it as, are you able to really set those boundaries so it doesn't affect you emotionally? How has that impacted you? Because you've delivered some deep stories, and you've interviewed some people that are very hurt.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I think that therapy, when I can carve out time for it helps, like, right, as far as just kind of passing on and talking. I think that look, when some of the big stories are about to come out, I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say that it's not like it stresses the whole household, right? I mean, and look, to be, again, like, if we're like being personal, like I am no longer married to the mother of like my child, right? And I am divorced, and if I am in another relationship, and it's wonderful, and everything worked the way it should, and I'm happy, and my child is happy, and everyone is happier. But this reporting and me being, I think, less further along on knowing how to kind of manage that stuff. Like, I'd be lying if I didn't say that wasn't a factor in, it's not going to be I'm not going to blame the whole thing on it, but like, it did not help things, how all consuming this can be. Right. And I think that sometimes, like, when you like surrender to it, and it's just like, I think that there was like a time where, like, if I just stay on it, I'll eventually come out. I think that it took me some time to realize, not in time, to make a difference in my first marriage. It and I'm on my way to being in a second marriage. And I think that, like, I did not figure out that, like, that, this was very much like a marathon and not like a sprint, that, like, that this wasn't, and So I think I was married to a non-journalist. I had my child with a non-journalist. I'm now with a fellow journalist. I think that also helps, like in terms of like understanding that sometimes. But even then, it's like I and you can be as transparent as possible and when it's coming. No, I mean they do have difficult. I mean, there's like sleepless nights, there's long days, there's long nights, and yeah, I mean I think that there's always like a bit of a you don't want to like sound paranoid, but then there's always a bit of like okay, like let's make sure that the doors are locked. Let's make sure that like no one's like no one is or outside the house that shouldn't be there. That nobody is kind of following me that I don't think should be following me, etc. Not that that's ever like happened to be upfront. But it is. I mean, it is difficult, and then sometimes like it you feel it in the survivor community, like when the word gets out that something's about to come out. Some of them, like you keep a really tight lid on it. Sometimes they're so big that like you create a wake, like the closer the story comes out, and then you start hearing from people, and they have their own triggers. The survivors have their own triggers, or like certain dates that come up, and then sometimes like you. To be fair, I mean, there's a lot of contacts and relationships that you're kind of juggling as you pursue something, and you take all that on, right? I mean, it's like if it's like somebody, it's like their story. If there's like a last minute delay, if it takes a little longer to come together than they expected, like there's a price they pay, and you kind of pay it with them, right? Because it's like you're getting their texts, you're getting their calls, you're getting their angst, and then sometimes I kind of like direct that at you, and it's not like you can be, and it's like especially some sources it's like will call you. There's some subjects and people that like you were writing on will call you, and it's easy to just be like, all right, like I'm at dinner with my family, like I'll just call them whenever I can. But then like sometimes there's a call that you get, and it doesn't matter what you're doing, and it's like I can't put this off, like I can't, so I have to step out. And then if it's an unpleasant conversation, it's like everyone sees you kind of pulled out of the moment,
Yeah.
and so it does take it is like all consuming in terms of like when you're managing like some of the sources, and you're managing some of the and then the people that you're writing about who don't want it to come out, right? I mean, they have resources, and they have and they have attorneys, and sometimes like when they push back, when they resist, when they put their statements out, it can get quite intense, and definitely not for the faint of heart. But yeah, I mean, through support, my family's been like a big support, and you do try to as soon as you can unplug, you do, and you try to kind of recharge the batteries. And I think that that's also something that like I've learned is like valid, to just be like sometimes like you can sense that there's like a big release, there's like a big story that comes out, and then I think I'll probably quietly, like, people in that universe won't hear from me for a little bit until like I kind of get until I get the next, until I kind of like recharge the batteries, and all right, like back into the fray.
So
But it's
when you're,
I
I mean, when
go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, so in your work, right? One of the difficult things when it comes to being a survivor advocate is defining what makes a win, and whether you're fighting a bunch of little battles or a war, right? And so when you were discussing, feeling like you said you don't know if it'll ever end, or something like that. So what is a win for Ramon? Like what's the overarching end goal here? Could there ever be something that occurs where you go, I did it finally. I can rest a bit, right? What are we marching towards? Or what are you marching towards, I should say?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, a lot of the way that this looks, there's like it's interesting because you develop a language with like people, right? So it's like some you'll say like someone's like someone's name, like whether it's like an abusive clergyman that you've kind of pursued justice against, or whether it's like someone's story that you've kind of finally gotten and told. Like you develop a language, and it's just like okay, like um and so there's like various fronts, and then like there's progress that's made, and then I think obviously one of the goals, it's difficult to know whether like there'll ever be just like an end. Obviously, the Lawrence Hecker case is one that, in terms of impact, I mean, there were crimes as it related to Lawrence Hecker, who, just briefly, for anyone who may not be familiar with it, right,
Yeah,
was
please
a
summarize it.
serial abusive. He was a serial child molester. He was a retired priest. The church knew for decades that he was a child molester. Actively took steps to cover that up. And then some of the documentation that contained some of the allegations against him were basically hidden, and then were also hidden in the context of the Chapter 11 bankruptcy case that the Archdiocese of New Orleans filed to try to deal with the fallout of kind of this ongoing clergy abuse crisis. They filed it in 2020. That was one where, like, I knew once I reported, and David Hammer helped me with a lot of these stories, but I went out sort of on my own and published what I thought was, as soon as I saw this document, I knew it was going to turn the tide. And it was one in which he confessed to serial child molestation, and he did not confess to the one that he was ultimately convicted of at the end. But I knew that once I report this, like, it is no longer going to become politically tenable to just let this guy live out his days peacefully. And so I reported that, and and then that was a story in June of 2023. If you Then a couple of months later, I knew that shortly thereafter, they were convening like a grand jury to try to weigh charges. The grand jury that was supposed to meet, and there were a couple of cancellations, and then I started consulting with David Hammer. David Hammer was, doing some reporting in parallel with me, and then we just made the strategic decision, like, let's go interview him. Let's confront him with this confession, right? Let's confront him with this confession, and he will. Let's see what he says. Chances are he's probably going to say something pretty compelling, and he did. I mean, he basically admitted, like, yeah, like, I did do those things. I did write this. This is authentic, but um, but it isn't a big deal, and here's why it's not a big deal. It was just a different time, right? It was a sexual revolution, and we know now that doing those things is wrong, but we didn't know that so clearly back then, and which is true, right? I mean, it was as illegal back then as it is now, and that's always been the point. And so we timed that story to come out, intentionally knowing that, okay, like, we're going to put this out. He's going to be on camera. He's going to be on the 6 o'clock news confessing to serial child molestation. I'm going to make it very uncomfortable for people to just sit on their hands and not do anything, right? And then we did that, and I think it was 2-3 weeks later he was charged, okay, with child rape and kidnapping, and that set off a whole other fuse, which was, okay, so now that he's facing charges, the trial. Is he going to plead guilty? What's going to happen? That was another 15 months in which it became about, is he in good enough shape to stand trial? Is he able to assist his attorneys in his own defense, which is a constitutional requirement, and things like that. And it was also just, that was probably the most difficult part of the process, because at that point people are just like, all right, tell me, is he going to plead guilty? Is he going to stay? But then it's like, if you just check out, like, it is very easy to just delay. And then they tried that, right? I mean, I think that there was one judge, ultimately 2 judges handled the case. One judge continued to delay it, continued to repeated mental evaluations, and the finding always came back the same, which was, he's in his 90s, and he acts like he's in his 90s, but he can probably stand trial, right? He is competent to stand trial right now, but it might not always stay this way. It was was always the finding, and then, okay, and then last minute cancellation. So ultimately, like, he just recused himself, citing some personality conflict, and that was about a year after the charges was filed, and then. That, to me, like, indicated that was, like, the behavior of, like, a judge who did not want to handle the case, right? And then it was transferred to a second judge who set it for trial in December of in December of 2024. I think that judge understood, I mean, that judge indicated, like, this case is going to go to trial or plead out. This case does not survive into 2025. And that was Judge Noddy Campbell, which was a much different attitude than Judge Ben Willer had. And then he pleaded guilty. I think when it came, I think that they realized that the judge is not going to just like delay it. There's no way out. Um, the Hecker decides to plead guilty. All of his survivors saw him admit that he was a child rapist. Um, he was sentenced to prison. He died very shortly after beginning his sentence because he was in his 90s. I can't imagine. Look, I'm not going to try to like read his mind or anything like that, but I think that it became very clear to him, like, you know, he was destined for the Louisiana State Penitentiary, and probably, with very few, if any, people at his side at that point. And he died on very shortly thereafter on his way to the Louisiana State Penitentiary, colloquially known as Angola. Um, and so that impact of like having someone, having, and that impact, I think of bringing someone like that to justice just in the nick of time. I think it's always like tricky. That's always the questions that people ask me. Like, do you think that like, I can see how the stressor of like having been convicted and finally being held to justice could have been something so stressful that it probably precipitated his end. But also I think that like if there had been even another few months delay, that maybe he dies without ever facing justice, and that is a scary thought to me.
Yeah.
But so that's a pretty clear, like, your reporting leads to like justice. But that's elusive. I mean, it's difficult to find many other examples like that. But our reporting has led to like a half dozen clergymen who look the credibly accused list that we know that the Archdiocese released in 2018, and some of these other dioceses released. Like, some of my reporting in conjunction with David has led to names being added to that list. Now, that's not a criminal conviction. That doesn't always necessarily mean that they're going to get much in the form of like civil penalties if they get anything, like they're survivors. But people do view that as like validation. And if like if they come forward and their person is put on their list, and sometimes we are in a position to be able to get their story out there and apply some pressure as far as getting people put on that list. People view that as like, okay, like I'm believed, and that's important to them, and that's another way to kind of measure like impact. That's another way to kind of measure, in effect. I think that and I know that this answer's long, but I guess if I can just add one last thing,
Yeah.
the bankruptcy that the Archdiocese filed in 2020, I believe more than ever, and this is not a guess. This isn't like this is a conclusion that I've reached through my reporting, is that the bankruptcy part of the strategy, as much as trying to kind of like undertake a process in which they can like settle, at a manageable cost, all the clergy abuse claims that they've had accumulated at that point and not been able to settle through the courts, right? In addition to that, part of it was the secrecy and the order, like the confidentiality orders that are, part of a case like that. Part of it was to just vault away their secrets for all of time. Like we get this like secrecy order for all of our worst secrets, and we can just we can put them away. I know that was part of the strategy. And so part of our job has been to look, and we've had sources who've helped us at great risk to themselves. I've been able to, use the public, using my knowledge of like, okay, well, like these records that were in the bankruptcy are probably in this criminal case. Let me use the public records system in this criminal case to see if those records ended up as part of that case, and now I can get that's a workaround to the bankruptcy, right, that I've been able to figure out. And so we've been able to report some of the things that I know that they were most closely guarded and hope would never come out. And that is also part of your job, to just like to show. And it's not just the point isn't to just like peddle in rumors and dirty laundry and things like that, but I mean, when you uncover evidence that like, okay, the Archdiocesan Lay Review Board, has 6 priests whose names are not on the credibly accused list, whose identity has mostly been kept from the public, that issued opinions that issued their recommendation. This person fits the credibly accused criteria, and therefore we think you should follow your protocol for public disclosure, etc. Um, and they take steps. They take steps like take their retirement benefits away, okay, and take steps like that to and do that in secret, which is the same thing that they do to and they're treating them like credibly accused priests by doing that, but yet not publicly disclosing them, and then trying to hope that that stays secret. When you find out about it, you find evidence of that, like part of your accountability journalism is to publish that and to show that, right? And then when all the archdiocese really says in response is, look, you don't really understand what's going on here and that there's other considerations. Well, that's fine. I mean, you have the prerogative to say that, and I'll quote you saying that, but that isn't going to diffuse like people finding out about these actions haven't been taken, right? So that's also been part of it. So obviously, there's like there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of measure it, but whether we reach the end, I mean, I don't know. I think it begins, the Archbishop of New Orleans has made the promise that when this is all over, they'll release they'll release the files. And, we've seen that's played out in other states. If what's happened in other states, which is always once a release is made, and then you kind of start back at square one, which is like, well, there's a lot that, seemingly should have been part of this release that isn't in there. And then that's a whole other years long process to kind of take out. I think that I hate to be so colloquial about this, but it's like, I think that grab a seat, because if you wait standing up, you might get tired. Because I think there's still years left.
If I can ask this question, so a lot of times I know we get accused of, attacking the church and hating the church, and Satan's using us to attack the church, which is a good and holy institution. And I know that you get those accusations, I'm sure. I've heard some of them myself. Anytime anybody reports on the church, and it's not that any of it is false reporting, it is all true. That's generally what lay people are told is, Satan is using them to attack the church. How do you feel that this reporting, do you feel like it is in some way holding the church accountable and also giving justice to? I mean, how do you describe maybe the process of both holding the church accountable with your reporting and at the same time doing justice for survivors?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just like on my watch, like you're not gonna like get your like spin about how, everyone's working. Like, I think that like there's some outlets and publications and coverage that you'd be reading that like kind of, the bankruptcy is just like any other bankruptcy, that's been pursued in that courthouse, and both sides are kind of working as hard as they can. There's been some hiccups, but everyone's working like that. That's just like the record. That isn't true, and the record doesn't show that. Right. And so you're gonna read like when I find evidence that like the Archdiocese of New Orleans in its bankruptcy, because of its influence that it's built as sort of like this very revered institution among the faithful in the New Orleans area, like when that results in favorable treatment, like I'm going to report that, right? And we're going to report that, and we're going to do everything we can to do that, because that's just the truth, right? And so at the same time, like, that is job one, right? As like, if you're going to be a journalist to do that. So I do think that. And then there's this other thing. There's obviously, I think that like, it isn't, I think that like when you read their internal communications, and even like when you are having like kind of these very tense conversations that are like off the record, but even some of the stuff that's like on the record, and there is like a preoccupation. I think that there is a way to view that like the bankruptcy and the everything that's been taken with respect to clergy abuse from 2018 on, right? If you remember 2018, the Pennsylvania grand jury report, some of the Jesuit revelations here locally, the late Theodore McCarrick and everything that we learned about him being, a clergy abuser. And then the the church's the New Orleans archdiocese's decision, like other similar institutions across the U.S., to kind of publish its clergy abuse list, which was shown to be woefully incomplete, right? I think that like when you take all that together and the actions that have been taken since then, there's been a preoccupation by the Archbishop of New Orleans to burnish his legacy, to kind of like leave behind a legacy that I'm the one that kind of took this on and tried my best. And yeah, maybe not everything went as well as it should, but like even when you see, I mean, he doesn't give me interviews anymore. He doesn't give David Hammer interviews anymore. We've certainly seen him give an interview in which he's like, look, if go see my three predecessors. This is sort of on them, and I'm trying to kind of clean up the mess that they left. I'm obviously paraphrasing pretty liberally when I say that, but like when that is a valid way to interpret his remarks of like, look, this thing got as bad, but this thing got as bad with actions that were taken, before me. Now he was obviously like a high ranking, vicar general for, and he was in high ranking positions for a couple of those, for at least one of those archbishops, but, anyway, so there is like a preoccupation of like, of trying to sort of like leave behind like a legacy where it's like, yeah, like that this was one thing that I dealt with, but I also did so much good, and I don't dispute that like that there are like social services and that there were like accomplishments that this administration of the archdiocese has had, but that doesn't like mean that like you don't as like a journalist like have to let that just sort of happen. You don't have to just like be a stenographer for that narrative of like, this is just one drop in like a much larger bucket, right? Like as a journalist, like it is okay to be like, this is the existential issue for this institution that like 500,000 Catholics in southeast Louisiana, like this is the existential issue that is confronting that institution that 500,000 Catholics in Southeast Louisiana hold dear, and so I think that like kind of telling a true accounting of that and not just taking anyone's word for it, because I think that there was some journalism around the Spotlight era in 2002 when the Boston Archdiocese revelations and the cover up of the scandal out there that obviously was at the center of the 2015 movie Spotlight, right? Like when there was a lot of like taking the word of the church that like, yeah, like, it wasn't as bad around here, or, think that's all in the past and it's gotten better. And I think that there was a little bit of that. And that's, I think a lot of just sort of like, okay, we've heard that messaging of like, yes, like let's try to move on. Like we acknowledge that there was like some stuff, but it's really painful and not that productive to sift through everything that kind of all the important stuff that happened out there. Let's try to move on, and I think that there's been some, look, it's journalism and running like a publication is difficult. There's a lot of different things you need to keep straight, but at the same time, like you don't have to let that happen. Like you don't have to like abide by that. And I think that it is like a valid pursuit to have like a true accounting of who knew what, when did they know it, how much have they known, how much have they come clean about. I think that's like a valid approach to this.
I have a question based off of something you said. So I talk about this every now and then on X, but in a lot of personal conversations with TentMakers, we discuss this particular phenomenon as well. The disconnect between the clergy and the lay people as it pertains to the sex abuse scandal. So, for instance, on X, and I still maintain this, and I argue this with anyone, I just choose X as my main form, typically where I do it, but that the sex abuse scandal is the ecclesiastical issue of the church's time, which you've basically mentioned, right? And so the idea behind this is that if I said, Ramon, look, you need to join the Roman Catholic Church because they're the one true church and you need to take your morality from them, and then you respond to me and go, oh, that institution that covers up child abuse, right? It crushes the typical popular apologetics of the Roman Catholic Church, right? I mean, anytime someone's ever saying that to me, telling me, well, the church says this, and it's always like, okay, well, let's calm down. Or anytime the church responds to, like for instance, I always bring this up too. I wrote an article on this, but whenever the Paris Olympics were had, and the church was like, oh, it looks like they've mocked the Last Supper, and there's drag queens and there's gays and blah blah blah, and you're like, really? Like you think you have the moral authority to come up and preach, any kind of moral social commentary while you're doing, this. But in your experience through reporting, I'm sure you've talked to clergy before. Do you see that there is a difference in the perception of the sex abuse scandal between your average lay, let's just say your average middle-aged lay family versus a priest or clergy in general?
Look, one of the things that has always struck me, I think that when the time has been up for some of the bishops or archbishops that have like not survived some of the stuff that we've seen happen in New Orleans, right? There's been some dioceses and archdioceses who have made a change in leadership for a lot less, and they endured a lot less than I think what New Orleans has over the last 7 years. Usually preceding that is a sort of like loss of trust or faith or something in the leader from the clergy, like from the from the um, priests, deacons, and then like the vicars and things like that. And I have not seen that in New Orleans. I don't know why. I don't know why that is. I think that publicly, like you have not seen that sort of like collective, like, we want something different. I've seen some of the and that isn't I don't want to sit here and say, because I know that there is a chance that people that I've had private conversations with who are, wish that decisions had been made differently and things had been handled differently and things like that. But that said, like a that's just one thing that I've noticed, that there hasn't been like a public, like, there have been shows of support, and failing shows of support, there has not been like a public, like, we want things to be different, right? So that's one thing that stands out. I think that there's obviously, like, I know I've spoken to like a lot of Catholics, like in my age range, that and also lay, like a mixture of like laity and elsewhere, who have said, like, who have been complimentary of the coverage. They know it's difficult. They can imagine. It's like, try to, don't listen to the negativity. This is good ultimately. Um, and so I guess that is like, I don't think anyone, look, there is like this sort of like counter narrative that's taken hold, that this is just like lefty liberals who are like
Yeah.
don't believe in God, who are like trying to take down like this great man, and it's nothing personal. It's nothing personal with like anybody, right? Like, it's just it and yet, like, yeah, there is some of that. Obviously it's not true, right? Like, it's just, there were evidence of crimes that were covered up by this institution, and that was validated in the way that the Hecker case culminated, and then the larger investigation that is, to be clear, an active, ongoing investigation into allegations of child sex trafficking at the Archdiocese of New Orleans over preceding decades, right? And it remains to be seen whether anyone in addition to Lawrence Hecker is going to be charged, but that was a part of that case, and it resulted in a guilty plea. Um, and so, but that is, and so nobody is like sitting here like, to be clear, like, there's been nobody that's like, everything was handled perfectly, and you're just, I think that where the disconnect comes is just that there's like some people that were like, well, this institution handled things as well as it could have, or as reasonably could have been expected, to the polar opposite, which is just like everybody needs to be thrown in jail, right? I mean, there's been some reactions to that. Obviously, I think the authorities are trying to, are following the line, and whatever happens, and I think that I'm trying to document as this investigation that I just referred to kind of plays out. We'll see what happens. I'm not going to sit here and like make any predictions. Like, I truly don't know whether we've seen the end of it with, Hector's conviction and death. It's possible. But it's also possible that there's another shoe to drop. And so, but I guess I wish I could, if I could just leave you with this, it's just that if I could get like the collective like clergy in front of me and ask them, it would be like, why, do you endorse the way that this is being led? Are you kind of getting along to go along? Do you truly believe that this is just like all just sort of anti Catholic, activism and attacks from outside? My guess is that there's probably a range of opinions in there. And it's, if what I will say is that there's been a good job of kind of keeping that in house done by the archdiocese. But I will say that that is something that has struck me as a big difference that we've seen in other places where when there's like a loss of faith among the ranks, there is a change of leadership. And there has not been that demand, that organized demand here. And I guess I would want to know why, because like I don't think that there's never been like a valid challenge of credibility of anything that like David or I have reported in our respective outlets or together, right? Like there hasn't. So, you know, failing one of those, which is just like, okay, this is all fake and it's been exposed as fake, then what is it? Because like silence in this case is it an endorsement? Is it just like, is it, what? And I'm not saying that it is, but if it's not, then what is it? And so that's what I'd leave it at.
So, Ramon, our goal and mission with TentMakers is to help survivors to heal and to educate the public on what is actually going on, and what hasn't been changed, the lack of transparency. So, being that is, wait, I just lost my train of thought.
Yeah, you did.
I am so
I
sorry.
could see it drifting
You saw
from
it?
your eyes, baby. I saw it
so
just
sorry.
flying away.
That
Remember,
totally
you're
just-
closing out.
I know. And you told me to do that. You pointed it out, and then that totally destroyed my thought. I was trying to wait. Hold on a second. Sorry, Marley. Give me a second here. There was a question I wanted to ask.
You know how Jimmy Neutron does that brain blast? Tish has the opposite, where she's got to it flows out. She's got to try to shove it all back in.
I have to put it all back.
Okay.
No,
I love my mother, by the way, just so you know.
I don't love my son sometimes.
But yeah, baby, you're wrapping
Wait,
it up.
I know. Give me 1 second, because it was an important question.
Okay.
I think I'm going to ask this question first and then let you wrap it up, Alex.
I'll wrap it up. That sounds good.
Okay. So, Ramon, with TentMakers, our goal is to help survivors to heal. That is, our goal. It's not to attack the church. It's not to scream and holler about the church making changes. They know what changes need to be made. They know what transparency is. They are the church that they are the church they claim to be or should be. So for survivors, how would you say that you go about reporting in order to help them to maybe find some justice and get some healing? Because when you do this reporting, especially like in the Heckler case or Hecker case, you are reporting facts that maybe never were able to come out before, but now are validating people. And I know survivors like for their stories to be told, because then they get validated because other people do hear true facts. So how has that helped survivors, in your opinion, the ones that you've heard from?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that obviously part of it is sometimes like it's just it can be difficult because it's like I wish that like you had enough time and bandwidth to tell everyone's story, right? I think that sometimes, how do I put this without like I don't want this to come out. I think that sometimes like if you've got a finite number of time in days, right, where it's like and there's like a story of like a Hecker survivor that you haven't had the chance to tell, or there's a story of like George Brignac, who was another infamous like now dead serial child clergy abuser, that like you didn't get to tell their individual story, and like there's like feelings of guilt on that. But then like what you think is like, okay, but if I channel my time and resources to maybe show this other case, and that can have an effect in terms of the bankruptcy, to maybe validate some of the questions about the fairness of the administration of the bankruptcy case, for example, and whether that can then and that's maybe something that we've never like heard about. And obviously the bankruptcy is something that has implications for hundreds of people, right, as opposed to just like one. And so sometimes like that's how you make those editorial decisions, to be like, without trying to go down like the rabbit hole of, Richard Trahan and the $400,000 fine that was leveraged against him, in which he for basically taking steps to get a clergy abuser removed from a high school campus in New Orleans, right? Very briefly, obviously, one of the revelations that we were able to show is that the justifications for which he was punished and some of his clients were punished for his actions, like the justifications that were given in court and what the actual investigation that led to those justifications and the report of that investigation showed, like, they were not a 1-in-1, right? They were not like a straight up like comparison. There were some differences there that I think needed to be exposed. And like when you do that, I think that validates some of the, you've got survivors who do not feel that they were being treated fairly in that case. And when you expose something like what I just described, that validates that they're just not being paranoid, that they're not just being contrarian, like they are telling the truth. Like they are telling the truth. And so that has implications for hundreds of people. And I hope that is something that's like helpful to, I think, the people that are the most important part of this equation, which are, the people that were victimized by, this crisis, the clergy abuse crisis. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's like my answer to the question. I think that I wish that I had all the time in the world, and I've got a lot of other obligations that I have at my employer, The Guardian. I'm editing copy that has, nothing to do with this topic, but they give me a lot of time and leeway to do that. And so my mandate, I think, is to make the most of that leeway. And then I think that one of the metrics that you use is like, how big of an impact might this have and how many people might this affect, and so that's how you kind of proceed. And so that's just one example where, like, I think that pursuing something like the story that I just described sometimes comes at the cost of kind of doing some of these individual kind of one-offs. And there's a lot of guilt like when you can't get to something quick enough, but I hope that, like, it is a bit of a consolation when it does validate something for dozens, if not hundreds, of other people that they're feeling. So
Ramon, at the end of every podcast, we typically have a message to our listeners, and we had talked about this before we started recording. But we have survivors from out of the state of Louisiana, of course, and also out of the country. We do have an international audience, and it's made up of some people who are just interested, who just want to hear about these things, right? We have survivors, we have families of survivors, we have advocates, attorneys, judges, and this is our first time, if I'm not mistaken, interviewing a journalist on here, particularly one that covers sex abuse crisis so often, so deeply, and one that's, of course, well known in the area. So typically we ask our podcast guests to give a message to survivors, number one, and then number two, give a message to everyone else, whether that be families of survivors, just regular old folks of whatever religion, whatever denomination. And so specifically for you, number one, and can you give a message to survivors? Very short. Number two, you had mentioned something about, I know you were talking about the clergy, right? But you were talking about silence and what does that silence mean? Can you, in your message to the other listeners, not the survivors, but to the other listeners, touch a little bit on some more of your thoughts on silence, particularly because I think a lot of people are paralyzed and their default is silence.
Yeah, look, I mean, the survivors coming forward is obviously difficult and pursuing, and it's so much, it's grueling and it's at great risk. And obviously, I think I've had a lot of conversations and a lot of time with people whose stories have never been told because they just never reached that point. Obviously, there are people who, believe you. There are people who will, like, use their time and resources and platforms to help you pursue justice, and it doesn't always work out. But man, when it does, it's like what happened with Hecker is to that survivor and to the survivors who were ready to support him. I mean, they made that happen with in parallel with prosecutors and investigators and journalists who believe them, right? Because the facts were because they were telling the truth and the other side was not telling the truth. And so, yeah, I would just say, in whatever way you do, whatever form this takes, keep that courage and never lose the belief or the faith in whatever form that looks like. And obviously, I think there's a lot of people that are inspired by you and in awe of you, and that includes me. As far as the second part of the question about and then if I could just mark and then we can pick up. Can you remind me what the second part of the
Oh
question?
yeah. The second part was I know it was like a 18-part question in one, but when you had mentioned about silence,
Yeah.
one of the things that we of course discuss here is just that there is a deafening silence even amongst quote unquote supporters.
Yeah.
So when speaking to the non-survivors, just speaking about, I guess, your thoughts on what it means to remain silent, and I guess kind of an encouragement to start speaking in whatever form, right? Little,
Yeah.
big, it doesn't have to be a billboard, right? It can be a whisper.
Yeah. And to answer the second part of your question, I mean, again, I think that some of these reports, the most important thing about these reports and the stories that we've told is that there has never been like a challenge on its accuracy or credibility, right? You can say whatever you want about the motivation and the timing and whether, but I think that like if you were, it's difficult for me to attribute like if you in the face of that, like if you're silent about then are you okay? I guess I would like a question about because I think that it's like a fair conclusion to arrive at that if you aren't like asking questions like we want things handled differently, we want people to be recognized, we want to move past this, but not by just ignoring survivors, but like just do what you need to be right by survivors and then move on. Um, I think I would like some answers as to I guess the is it that like everyone's okay with like the way things are going here, and if they're not, then why have there been no like obvious explanations for why not, right? And I get that. Look, I get that it's repetitive, and there's no one that is more like that wishes that this job was done, but like it's not, and then so I guess my question would be like if you are like remaining silent about like whether how the leadership in place right now is doing things and if you want it to be different but aren't saying so, I guess I'd be curious to know to explain why why that is. And I get, look, a lot of the times you get that like, oh well, my kid goes to school and I'm scared, and look, I'm frightened. I mean, some of the stuff I'm frightened about it because my child goes to those schools too, and like I've got people all around me that you got family members and people who are important to you who are like in these like institutions, and so yeah, you're scared, but I don't know. I mean, I think it feels I would like I would like someone to explain to me that like if your silence doesn't mean being okay with it, then what does it mean? Then what does it mean? Because I have been stunned that there hasn't been like a loss of support among like in the form of like people being like, we want something different. Like we have not seen that in New Orleans. We've seen it in other cities and we've seen that have effects, but we haven't seen it in New Orleans. And the other cities and the other communities had a fraction of the things that have been exposed here in New Orleans, right? And so if I sound frustrated, it's because like, why not? Like, is there something that it takes for that sort of scene to play out here? But for now, otherwise, I think that a lot of we arrived at collectively, like this community got to the point that it's gotten because of too much silence.
Ramon, thank you so much for joining us on Resilience in the Shadows, and we look forward to possibly in the future being able to do maybe more episodes with you concerning maybe specific stories that have broken or popular talking points that are going on at the time.
Thank you, Ramon. We were so grateful that you agreed to be our guest.
Thank you. Happy to come on anytime.
Thank you for joining us for this thought-provoking episode of Resilience in the Shadows. We hope today's conversation with Ramon Vargas has shed light on the powerful role journalism can play in uncovering truth and supporting survivors. A heartfelt thank you to Ramon for his dedication to ethical storytelling and for amplifying the voices of those who are so often overlooked. His work serves as a powerful reminder of the impact informed reporting can have on justice and reform. If you'd like to read more of Ramon's work, you can find his articles at The Guardian online. His reporting continues to inspire awareness and accountability around the world. We also want to remind you of the vital work being done by TentMakers of Louisiana. To learn more about our mission to support survivors, educate communities, and advocate for justice, please visit www.tentmakers.la. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories of resilience and healing. If you have a story of courage and resilience or know someone whose journey would inspire our audience, we invite you to contact us through our website. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay resilient and remember that even in the shadows, there is light.